Serena Harper was no stranger to challenges. A former operative in the United States Coast Guard's Elite Search and Rescue Division, she had spent over a decade navigating the most dangerous waters, pulling people from near certain death and earning respect among her peers. But the challenges she faced now were of a different kind, more insidious, less visible, and, to Serena, far more personal. After leaving active service, she had turned her expertise toward environmental justice, founding an independent research group focused on combating corporate pollution in underserved communities. The stakes were no longer about saving individual lives, they were about saving entire ecosystems and, in some ways, the very soul of the communities that depended on them. On this particular morning, Serena found herself in a desolate industrial zone on the outskirts of Blackthorn, a small but notorious town known for its unchecked pollution and the heavy hand of its law enforcement. Blackthorn had been a battleground for years between local activists and the corporations that dominated the region. Factories loomed over the polluted river like silent sentinels, their chimneys still exhaling faint wisps of smoke into the pale blue sky. The air smelled faintly of oil and burnt chemicals, a stark reminder of the environmental degradation that had become commonplace here. Serena was here for a field test. She had designed a series of cutting-edge autonomous drones capable of scanning water for pollutants, mapping environmental damage, and even assisting in rescue operations if necessary. Today's mission was to test how well the drones could navigate the strong currents of the Blackthorn River, notorious for its unpredictable tides and hidden hazards beneath the murky water. Armed with her waterproof equipment, including a rugged tablet to control the drones and a custom-built sensor rig, Serena moved with the calm confidence of someone who knew the terrain and its dangers. The bridge where she set up was old, rusted, and long since forgotten by the city's infrastructure team. It creaked ominously underfoot as she positioned her equipment near the edge. The view below was a swirling cocktail of brown water, litter, and sludge, a stark contrast to the natural beauty this river must have once held. Serena exhaled sharply, tightening her ponytail as the sun glared down on her. She couldn't afford to let the scope of the damage overwhelm her. She had work to do. As Serena calibrated the drones, she thought about her late father, a civil engineer who had spent his life advocating for sustainable urban development. His death, linked to complications from prolonged exposure to industrial pollutants, had been a turning point for her. It wasn't just the loss, it was the sheer injustice of it. Growing up, Serena seen how easily corporations avoided accountability, paying off local officials and silencing whistleblowers. Her father's pleas for cleaner practices had gone unheard, drowned out by the allure of quick profits. His death had left a void in her life, but it also ignited a fire in her that never dimmed. Lost in her thoughts, she almost didn't hear the low hum of a patrol car piling up behind her. The sound of tires crunching gravel snapped her back to reality. She turned to see a black and white cruiser with the Blackthorn Police Department's emblem emblazoned on its side. A figure stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in the crisp uniform of authority. Officer Mark Steele. Steele was a familiar figure in Blackthorn, infamous among locals for his aggressive tactics and quick temper. At 38, he had been with the department for over a decade, but had never risen beyond the rank of patrol officer. Frustrated by what he perceived as a lack of respect from his superiors, Steele had developed a chip on his shoulder the size of a boulder. His bias against minorities and activists was an open secret, though his department conveniently turned a blind eye, viewing him as a necessary enforcer in a town resistant to change. Serena watched as Steele slammed his car door shut, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the harsh sunlight. He approached her with the swagger of a man who thrived on intimidation. She straightened, her hand instinctively resting on her tablet. "Morning," Steele barked, his voice sharp and curt. His tone carried no warmth, only suspicion. His eyes flicked to the equipment scattered around her, narrowing as if assessing a threat. "What exactly are you doing out here?" Serena took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had dealt with men like Steele before, men who equated authority with dominance, who wielded their badges like weapons. "I'm conducting a research project," she replied evenly, meeting his gaze. "It's fully permitted. I can show you the documentation." Steele didn't seem interested in her answer. He stepped closer, looming over her like a storm cloud. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "What kind of research involves expensive gadgets on private property?" "This isn't private property," Serena said firmly, though her pulse quickened. "It's public land and I'm within my rights to be here. Like I said, I have all the necessary permits." Steele smirked, taking another step forward. "You don't look like the kind of person who belongs here," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken bias. "Let me see some ID." Serena clenched her jaw, but she handed him her driver's license. Steele studied it for a moment before handing it back with a flick of his wrist, as though it were contaminated. "Harper, huh?" he muttered, his lips curling into a sneer. "What are you really doing out here, Harper? Spying? Stirring up trouble?" The insinuation stung, but Serena refused to rise to the bait. "I'm here to collect water samples and test equipment," she said firmly. "That's it. I'm not here to stir up anything." Steele tilted his head, his smirk deepening. "Sure you're not," he said, his tone oozing disbelief, "because people like you always seem to have an agenda." Serena's grip tightened on her tablet. She could feel her frustration building, but she knew better than to let it show. Men like Steele thrived on provoking reactions, and she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. The tension between them was palpable, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the river below. Steele seemed to weigh his options, his eyes darting between Serena and her equipment. Finally, he leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "If I were you, I'd pack up and leave. Right now. Before things get complicated." Serena met his gaze, her heart pounding. She knew what he was trying to do, intimidate her into submission. But she also knew that leaving meant abandoning her work, her mission. And that was something she couldn't do. "I have a job to finish," she said quietly but firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Steele's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. He took a step back, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun. "Suit yourself," he said. "But don't say I didn't warn you." As he turned and walked back to his patrol car, Serena felt a chill run down her spine. She knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Serena Harper returned her attention to her equipment as Officer Steele walked back to his patrol car, the echo of his boots crunching against the gravel cutting through the oppressive silence. She could feel the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, her instincts screaming that this man wasn't done with her. But she forced herself to focus. She had come too far to let someone like him derail her work. The drones were ready to deploy, their sensors calibrated to detect even the smallest traces of industrial pollutants in the water. The project was months in the making, and she wasn't about to let a bully with a badge scare her away. The first drone slid off the edge of the bridge and into the river with a smooth, controlled descent, its camera feed popping up on Serena's tablet. She watched as it maneuvered through the murky currents, the water thick with oil residue and clumps of algae. The pollution levels were worse than she'd anticipated, and her heart sank as she noted the data. Whatever the nearby factories were dumping into this river, It wasn't just affecting the water, it was seeping into the soil, poisoning the ecosystem, and by extension, the people who lived in the surrounding areas. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't notice Steele hadn't left. Instead of driving off, he had parked his cruiser a short distance away, watching her through the rearview mirror. His jaw tightened as he observed her, the expensive-looking equipment spread out around her only fueling his suspicion. To him, Serena didn't belong here, not in this neighborhood, not with that gear, and certainly not with her defiance of his authority. He had dealt with her kind before, people who thought they were above the rules, who hid behind permits and legal jargon to justify sticking their noses where they didn't belong. And this time he was determined to put an end to it. Steele's radio crackled to life, but he ignored it, his eyes locked on Serena. He stepped out of the car again, this time without the pretense of politeness. The heavy slam of his door startled Serena, and she glanced up, her stomach sinking as she saw him approaching once more. His body language had shifted. There was no casual swagger now, only a cold, deliberate focus that made her pulse quicken. "Didn't I tell you to leave?" Steele's voice was sharp, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. He stopped a few feet from her, his hand resting on his belt just above his holstered weapon. Serena straightened, holding her ground. "Officer, I told you, I'm conducting research. I have every right to be here. I've already shown you my permits." "I don't give a damn about your permits," Steele interrupted, his voice rising. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "You think a piece of paper means you can come into my town and start snooping around? That's not how this works." Her throat tightened, but she refused to look away. "This isn't your town," she said evenly. "This is public land, and I'm not breaking any laws. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to call your supervisor." The mention of his supervisor seemed to strike a nerve. Steele's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching as a vein pulsed at his temple. He took another step forward, now close enough that Serena could see the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. "You think you're smarter than me, huh? Think you can just waltz in here and do whatever the hell you want?" "This isn't personal," Serena replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "I'm just here to collect data." "It is personal," Steele snapped, cutting her off, "because people like you never show up unless you're looking for trouble." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken bias. Serena's hands tightened around her tablet as she fought to keep her composure. She had dealt with men like him before, men who used their authority to mask their insecurity, who lashed out when they felt their control slipping. But this was different. The hostility radiating off him wasn't just about her work, it was about who she was and what she represented. "Officer, if you continue to harass me, I'll have no choice but to file a formal complaint," Serena said, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her gut. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Steele's face darkened, his smirk vanishing as a flicker of something dangerous crossed his expression. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes boring into hers with a mix of anger and calculation. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing the tablet from her hands. "Hey," Serena protested, reaching for it, but Steele stepped back, holding it out of her reach. "Give that back. That's private property." He ignored her, his eyes scanning the screen. The live feed from the drone was still running, the camera capturing the swirling pollution beneath the surface. Steele's lip curled in disgust as he swiped through the data. "What the hell is all this? You spying on the factories? Feeding this crap to one of those activist groups?" "It's environmental research," Serena said through gritted teeth, her anger bubbling to the surface. "And you have no right to." Before she could finish, Steele turned and hurled the tablet over the edge of the bridge. Time seemed to slow as Serena watched it arc through the air before splashing into the river below, the screen flickering and dying as it sank beneath the surface. "You son of a," Serena started, but Steele cut her off, stepping closer until their faces were inches apart. "You don't get it, do you?" he growled, his voice low and venomous. "People like me run this town. Not you. Not your fancy equipment. And certainly not your damn permits." Serena's heart pounded as she stared up at him, her mind racing. She could feel the heat of his anger, the raw force of his presence pressing down on her. But beneath the fear was a spark of defiance, a refusal to back down no matter how much he tried to intimidate her. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, her voice trembling but resolute. "Everything you just did is illegal, and you're going to regret it." Steele barked out a laugh, the sound sharp and humorless. "The only mistake I made was wasting my time with you," he sneered. "Now pack up your crap and get out of here before I decide to charge you with trespassing. Or worse." Serena didn't move, her mind racing as she tried to calculate her next move. But Steele wasn't done. He reached for the sensor rig near the edge of the bridge, his intention clear. He was going to destroy everything. As Serena lunged forward to stop him, Steele turned sharply, his hand slamming into her shoulder. The force of the blow sent her stumbling backward, her foot slipping on the loose gravel. For one terrifying moment, she teetered on the edge, her arms flailing for balance. And then she was falling. The last thing she saw before she hit the water was Steele's expression, a mixture of anger, satisfaction, and the faintest flicker of fear. The cold hit Serena Harper like a sledgehammer as her body plunged into the river. The shock of the icy water stole her breath, and for a moment panic threatened to take over. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, pulling her downstream with alarming force. But Serena wasn't just anyone. Years of training with the Coast Guard had prepared her for moments like this. Her instincts kicked in, and she forced herself to remain calm, focusing on what she could control. As she fought to keep her head above water, she took stock of her situation. The river was a churning mess of debris, pollution, and swift currents. Every gulp of air she managed to take burned her lungs with the acrid taste of chemicals. Her heavy jacket weighed her down, making it harder to move, but she knew she couldn't afford to panic. Survival meant focus. Her fingers fumbled for the emergency release clasp on her jacket. With a practiced motion, she freed herself from the weight, letting the fabric sink into the murk below. The chill bit into her skin, but the added mobility was worth it. She reached for the waterproof smartwatch strapped to her wrist, the one linked to her drone system. To her relief, the watch was still functional, its small screen glowing faintly against the gloom. She tapped a sequence, sending a distress signal to her support team and activating one of her drones, still stationed upriver. The drone responded instantly, its small but powerful motor propelling it toward her location. A second tap on her watch initiated its tracking beacon, locking onto her position as it closed the distance. Serena knew she couldn't wait for the drone to reach her. She had to act. Drawing on her training, she angled her body and kicked toward the nearest shoreline, using the current to her advantage rather than fighting against it. Above her, the bridge loomed, and with it, Officer Steele. He stood at the edge, watching her struggle with an unsettling calmness. His hands were on his hips, his stance wide and firm, as if he were surveying a pest that he'd finally exterminated. For a brief moment, Serena thought she saw hesitation in his posture, a flicker of doubt about what he'd just done. But it passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the same cold indifference he'd shown from the start. Satisfied that she wouldn't resurface, Steele turned and walked back to his patrol car. The crunch of his boots on gravel was swallowed by the roar of the river, and within moments, the sound of his engine echoed through the canyon. He was gone. Serena gritted her teeth. The sight of Steele driving off igniting a fire in her chest. Her survival wasn't just about her now. It was about justice. She refused to let him get away with this. She forced her arms and legs to move against the growing fatigue, each stroke bringing her closer to the riverbank. The drone reached her first, its small floodlight cutting through the dark water. It hovered just above her, its camera tilting to capture her movements. Serena reached for the handle on its underside and held on as it helped pull her the last few feet to safety. Her body collapsed onto the muddy bank, her lungs heaving as she gasped for air. The taste of oil and grime lingered in her mouth, but she didn't care. She was alive. Once she caught her breath, Serena sat up, wiping the water from her face. The drone hovered nearby, its quiet hum a reminder of the technology she had spent years perfecting. She tapped her smartwatch again, bringing up the drone's live feed. It had recorded everything: Steele's actions on the bridge, her fall into the river, and his cold retreat. The footage was undeniable proof of his wrongdoing. But Serena didn't have time to dwell on that. Her equipment on the bridge was still in danger, and she knew Steele would be back, perhaps with reinforcements. She couldn't let him destroy the data she'd already collected. That data was the heart of her mission, the evidence she needed to expose the factories polluting the river and the system enabling them. It wasn't just her fight, it was for the people who lived downstream, who drank this water and bore the brunt of the corporation's greed. With renewed determination, Serena activated the second drone, which was still tethered to the sensor rig on the bridge. She piloted it remotely, guiding it to detach from the equipment and return to her location. The drone obeyed, its sleek frame cutting through the air as it carried the valuable sensor array back to her. She caught it with trembling hands, relief washing over her as she inspected the hardware. Despite Steele's interference, the data was intact. As Serena secured the equipment, the sound of an engine broke through the quiet. Her head snapped up, her heart sinking as she saw headlights bouncing along the dirt road leading to the riverbank. Steele had returned. This time he wasn't alone. A second patrol car followed close behind, its lights off but its presence unmistakable. Two more officers stepped out alongside Steele, their faces unreadable in the dim light. Serena's mind raced. She didn't recognize the other two, but their body language suggested they weren't here to play nice. Steele gestured toward the bridge, and the three of them began walking in her direction. Serena's pulse quickened. She knew she was outnumbered, and after what Steele had already done, she had no illusions about how far he was willing to go to silence her. She needed to act fast. "Activate defense protocol," she muttered, her voice trembling as she tapped a new sequence on her watch. The drones responded instantly, their lights switching from a soft white to an intense red. A high-pitched whine filled the air as the drones entered defensive mode, circling her in a tight formation. Each drone was equipped with non-lethal deterrents, blinding strobe lights and piercing sound frequencies designed to disorient aggressors. Steele and his colleagues froze as the drones flared to life, their sudden aggression catching them off guard. "What the hell?" one of the officers muttered, shielding his eyes from the strobing lights. "Stand down." Steele barked, his voice cracking with frustration. He took a step forward, his hand resting on his gun. "You're only making this worse for yourself." Serena rose to her feet, her legs unsteady but her resolve unshaken. "You've already done enough, Officer Steele," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I have everything I need to prove what you've done. Walk away now, or you'll regret it." Steele's face twisted with anger, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to fight back, and certainly not like this. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure about how to proceed. The drone's strobe lights intensified, forcing them to shield their eyes further. "You think this will save you?" Steele shouted, his voice strained. "You're just digging yourself a deeper hole." "No, officer," Serena said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "You're the one in the hole, and I'm done letting you drag me down with you." With a sharp gesture, she sent one of the drones flying toward the patrol cars. Its sensors targeted the vehicle's electronics, disabling their communication systems and ensuring Steele couldn't call for backup. The second drone hovered above her, its camera locked onto the officers, recording every move they made. Steele's confidence faltered, his bravado slipping as the reality of the situation sank in. He had underestimated Serena, dismissed her as another victim in a town where power went unchecked. But now he was the one cornered, his actions exposed and his authority challenged. "This isn't over," Steele growled, his voice low and venomous. He gestured to the other officers, and together they retreated toward their cars, the weight of their failure hanging heavy in the air. As they drove off, Serena allowed herself a moment of relief, but she knew this was far from over. Steele wouldn't stop, and neither would the system that protected him. She had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. She looked down at her watch, the drone feed still displaying Steele's retreating car. Her grip tightened as a new wave of determination surged through her. If Steele wanted a fight, she was ready, and this time she wasn't playing by his rules. The silence of the riverbank was deafening after Steele and the other officers retreated. Serena Harper stood there, her clothes soaked and clinging to her skin, the chill of the night biting into her bones. The defensive drones hovered quietly now, their red lights fading back to a soft white, as if sensing the immediate threat had passed. But Serena knew better. Steele wasn't the type to back down, and his sudden retreat wasn't a concession, it was a recalibration. He would return, and when he did, he'd come back with a more ruthless plan. Serena looked down at her smartwatch, its screen displaying the time-stamped footage from the drones. It wasn't just a record of what Steele had done, it was her lifeline, her proof. But proof alone wouldn't be enough. She had learned the hard way that justice wasn't automatic, especially in a town like Blackthorn. The system that Steele operated within was designed to protect people like him, not hold them accountable. If she wanted to win this fight, she needed more than evidence. She needed leverage. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint buzzing sound. Serena glanced up to see a sleek black drone descending from the sky, its matte finish almost invisible against the darkness. Relief washed over her as she recognized it. This was one of her personal drones, dispatched automatically when she sent the distress signal. The drone carried a small waterproof case, which it gently dropped at her feet before hovering silently at her side. Serena crouched and opened the case, retrieving a dry set of clothes and a compact satellite phone. She quickly changed out of her wet clothes, her fingers numb from the cold, and dialed a number she hadn't used in months. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Serena." The voice was calm but tinged with concern. It was Greg Mason, a former Coast Guard colleague, and one of the few people she trusted implicitly. "Greg, I need your help," Serena said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions churning inside her. "I'm in Blackthorn. Things have gotten complicated." There was a pause on the other end, the weight of her words sinking in. "Complicated how?" "Local cop tried to kill me," she said bluntly. "Shoved me off a bridge into the river. I've got it all on tape, but I need more to take him down. Can you get here?" Another pause. Then Greg's voice returned, this time sharper, more focused. "I'll be there in 2 hours. Don't do anything reckless until I get there." Serena almost laughed at the irony. Too late for that, she said before ending the call. With Greg on his way, Serena turned her attention back to the drones. She connected her smartwatch to the central control system, bringing up the full suite of tools she had at her disposal. The footage she had already captured was valuable, but she needed to know more. Steele's aggression wasn't random, it was targeted. There was something about her presence that had set him off, and she suspected it had less to do with her research and more to do with what, or who, he was protecting. She pulled up the data logs from her drones, specifically focusing on the environmental readings they had collected near the factories upstream. The pollution levels were off the charts, higher than even her worst projections. Traces of heavy metals, industrial solvents, and other toxic substances saturated the water. These weren't just minor violations, they were catastrophic breaches of environmental law. If the factories were dumping waste this recklessly, it meant they were either desperate or had someone powerful shielding them from accountability. Serena's jaw tightened as she scrolled through the data. She wasn't just up against Steele, she was up against a system that had allowed this level of corruption to thrive. The factories, the police, the local government, they were all pieces of the same machine. And if she wanted to expose them, she needed to find the weakest link. She didn't have to wait long. Her drone sensors picked up movement near the factories, and Serena immediately directed the camera feed toward the source. What she saw made her blood run cold. A convoy of unmarked trucks was moving in and out of one of the largest factories, their cargo covered with heavy tarps. Men in dark uniforms, not police but clearly security, patrolled the area, their flashlights cutting through the night. This wasn't normal factory activity, it was a cleanup operation. Someone had gotten spooked, likely by her presence, and they were trying to cover their tracks. Serena knew she had to act fast. If they managed to erase the evidence before she could gather it, everything she had risked so far would be for nothing. She activated the drone's advanced surveillance modes, programming them to follow the trucks and record their movements. At the same time, she used the satellite phone to send the footage to a secure cloud server, ensuring that no matter what happened to her, the evidence would survive. But even as she worked, a gnawing sense of unease crept over her. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and operating on enemy turf. One wrong move, and she wouldn't just lose the fight, she'd lose her life. The sound of an engine broke through her thoughts, and Serena turned to see a black SUV approaching the riverbank. For a brief moment, her heart leapt into her throat, fearing that Steele had returned. But as the vehicle drew closer, she recognized Greg behind the wheel. The SUV came to a stop, and Greg stepped out, his tall frame silhouetted against the headlights. "You look like hell," he said, his voice a mix of concern and relief as he took in her disheveled appearance. "Feel like it too," Serena admitted, brushing a strand of damp hair out of her face. "Thanks for coming." Greg nodded, his expression turning serious as he glanced at the hovering drones. "You've been busy. What's the situation?" Serena quickly brought him up to speed, explaining everything that had happened since Steele first approached her on the bridge. She showed him the footage, the environmental data, and the live feed of the trucks at the factory. Greg listened intently, his jaw tightening as the full scope of the situation became clear. "This is bigger than just one bad cop," he said finally. "You're dealing with a whole network of corruption." "I know," Serena said. "But Steele's the key. If we take him down, the rest of it will start to unravel." Greg hesitated, then nodded. "All right, what's the plan?" Serena took a deep breath, her mind racing as she pieced together the next steps. "We need to force their hand," she said. "Make them react. If we can draw Steele and his buddies back here, we can expose their connection to the factories." "And how do we do that?" Greg asked, raising an eyebrow. Serena's lips curled into a grim smile. We give them something they can't ignore. Together they devised a plan. Using the drones, Serena would create the illusion of a full-scale operation to retrieve the evidence from the river and the surrounding areas. The drone's lights and sensors would make it seem like she was mobilizing a much larger team than she actually had, drawing attention back to her location. Meanwhile, Greg would use his military-grade communication equipment to intercept police radio frequencies, ensuring they knew exactly where to find her. The bait was set, and it didn't take long for Steele to bite. Within 30 minutes, the faint sound of sirens echoed through the night. Serena and Greg watched from their concealed position as multiple patrol cars converged on the riverbank, their lights flashing in the darkness. Steele was among them, his face twisted with anger as he stepped out of his car, barking orders to the other officers. This ends tonight, he snarled, his hand resting on his holstered gun. No more games. Serena's heart pounded as she watched him approach, but she didn't flinch. This time she wasn't running. This time she was ready. The headlights of multiple patrol cars cut through the darkness, bouncing off the uneven terrain of the riverbank. Serena Harper and Greg Mason remained hidden, crouched low behind a cluster of dense brush on higher ground. From their vantage point, they had a clear view of the unfolding chaos below. Officer Steele stood at the center of it all, barking orders as he directed his fellow officers to fan out and search the area. His face was a mask of fury, his movements sharp and erratic. It was clear that Steele had taken the bait and he was coming for blood. Serena adjusted the settings on her smartwatch, redirecting the drones to create more distractions. Their lights flared brightly, and the sound of their motors grew louder as they zipped across the river and around the patrol cars, creating the illusion of a coordinated effort to retrieve evidence. The officers swore and shielded their eyes as the drone's strobing lights disoriented them. Steele, however, remained focused. His gaze scanned the darkness, his jaw clenched tightly. She's here, Steele growled, his voice cutting through the noise. I know she is. Spread out and find her. Greg leaned closer to Serena, keeping his voice low. He's losing it. The more we push him, the sloppier he gets. That's the plan, Serena whispered back, her eyes never leaving Steele. But we need more than just his anger. We need him to incriminate himself. Greg nodded, his hand resting on the small, rugged laptop he had brought with him. The screen displayed intercepted police radio frequencies, each line of text detailing Steele's frantic communications with dispatch. Greg had been recording every word, compiling a damning record of Steele's escalating paranoia and reckless commands. He's already given us plenty, Greg said, glancing at the laptop. But I get the feeling he's not done digging his own grave. Serena didn't respond. Her focus was on the patrol cars where a second, unmarked vehicle had just arrived. The door opened, and a man in plain clothes stepped out, a middle-aged figure with sharp features and an air of authority. Serena recognized him immediately. Lieutenant Victor Haynes, Steele's direct superior. Haynes is here, Serena muttered. This just got a lot more complicated. Greg followed her gaze, frowning. Think he's here to shut this down or back Steele up? We'll find out soon enough, Serena replied grimly. At the riverbank, Haynes approached Steele, his expression a mixture of frustration and curiosity. What the hell is going on here, Steele? Haynes demanded. I got a call about some rogue drones and unauthorized activity. Why are half the patrol cars in Blackthorn parked by the damn river? Steele turned to face Haynes, his face flushed with barely contained rage. It's Harper, he said, practically spitting the words. She's here, Lieutenant. She's got drones everywhere, probably trying to recover evidence to pin something on us. Haynes raised an eyebrow. Evidence of what, exactly? Steele hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to articulate his thoughts. He couldn't very well admit the truth that he had shoved Serena off a bridge and now feared she might have survived, with proof of his actions. Instead, he opted for deflection. "She's working with those environmental activists," Steele said, "trying to frame the factories for pollution or sabotage. She's stirring up trouble, and we need to shut her down before this turns into a circus." Haynes studied Steele for a long moment, his sharp eyes narrowing. "You're sweating, Steele," he said finally, "and you look like you haven't slept in days. Are you sure you're thinking clearly?" "I'm fine," Steele snapped, his voice tight. "I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" Haynes replied coolly. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've got half the department chasing shadows." Steele's fists clenched, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. "She's here," he repeated, his voice low and insistent. "I can feel it." Haynes sighed, clearly torn between indulging Steele and reining him in. "Fine," he said after a moment. "But you better find something, Steele. If this blows up in our faces, you'll be the one taking the fall." From their hidden position, Serena and Greg watched the exchange unfold. Serena's jaw tightened as she observed Haynes' body language calm, calculated, and utterly self-serving. He wasn't here to ensure justice, he was here to protect his department's reputation. "He's covering his ass," Serena said quietly. "He doesn't care about what Steele did. He just doesn't want a scandal." "Then let's give him one," Greg replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Serena glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "What are you thinking?" Greg gestured to the laptop. "We've got enough on Steele to bury him. But if we can tie Haynes into this, it's game over for both of them. We just need to push a little harder." Serena hesitated, her mind racing. She knew Greg was right, but the risk was enormous. If they pushed too hard, they could lose everything. But as she looked back at Steele, still barking orders like a man possessed, her resolve hardened. She couldn't let him get away with what he had done. Not this time. "Do it," she said finally, "but be careful." Greg's plan was simple but effective. Using the drones, he created a series of distractions that forced Steele and his officers to spread themselves thin. One drone circled back to the bridge, its floodlight illuminating the spot where Steele had attacked Serena. Another flew upriver, drawing the attention of 2 patrol cars that sped off in pursuit. Each time the officers followed, Greg intercepted their radio communications, adding more evidence to his growing file. Meanwhile, Serena used the chaos to position herself closer to Steele and Haynes. She stayed low, moving through the shadows with the precision of a trained operative. Her smartwatch displayed a live feed from the drones, allowing her to track the officers' movements in real time. When she was close enough, she activated the microphone on one of the drones, its speakers broadcasting her voice across the riverbank. "Looking for me, Steele." Serena's voice was calm, but it carried a sharp edge that cut through the night like a blade. Steele froze, his eyes darting wildly as he tried to locate the source of the sound. "Where are you, Harper?" he shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "Show yourself!" "Why?" "So you can finish what you started." Serena's voice echoed from multiple directions, disorienting Steele and the other officers. "Or are you afraid I already have everything I need to take you down?" "You don't have anything," Steele roared, his composure crumbling. "You're just a washed-up activist with a bunch of toys. You think anyone's going to believe you over me?" "Oh, I think they'll believe me," Serena replied, her voice cold and measured. "Especially when they see the footage. You remember, don't you? The moment you shoved me off the bridge and left me to drown." Haynes' head snapped towards Steele, his expression darkening. "What the hell is she talking about, Steele?" "It's a lie," Steele shouted, panic creeping into his voice. She's making it up. There's no footage. Is that what you told yourself as you watched me fall? Serena retorted. That no one would find out. That no one would care. Shut up! Steele bellowed, drawing his gun. Come out, you coward! Haynes stepped forward, his face a mask of fury. Stand down, Steele. What did you do? I didn't do anything. Steele insisted, his voice shaking. She's trying to frame me. Haynes looked unconvinced, his hand resting on his own weapon. If you've dragged this department into a mess we can't clean up, Steele, I swear to God. Their argument was interrupted by the sound of a drone descending, its camera trained directly on Steele. A red light blinked steadily as it recorded every word, every movement. Steele's face twisted with rage as he aimed his gun at the drone, but before he could fire, Serena's voice rang out once more. Game over, Steele. The tension at the riverbank was suffocating, as though the very air had thickened under the weight of what was about to unfold. Officer Steele stood in the glaring light of the drone's camera, his face twisted with fury and desperation. The blinking red light on the drone was like a metronome, counting down the seconds of his unraveling. Lieutenant Haynes loomed a few steps behind him, his expression dark and unreadable, but his posture tense, like a man calculating how deep into this mess he was willing to sink. You think you've got me? Steele spat, his voice trembling as he pointed his gun at the hovering drone. You think this changes anything? From the shadows, Serena Harper watched it all play out, her heart pounding. She was close now, crouched low behind a stack of discarded crates, just beyond the floodlights of the patrol cars. Her smartwatch displayed the live feed from the drone, capturing Steele's every word. It was exactly what she needed, raw, unfiltered proof of his recklessness and guilt. But she wasn't finished yet. Steele had to incriminate himself further, and Haynes needed to be tied to this, or the system would simply bury the evidence along with her story. Greg Mason's voice came through Serena's earpiece, calm and focused. He's cracking. Push him a little harder. Serena adjusted her position, her body tense but her mind razor sharp. She tapped her smartwatch, activating the drone's speaker. Her voice echoed across the riverbank once again, cold and steady. You can't shoot your way out of this, Steele. That footage is already backed up. The moment you pull that trigger, your career is over. Steele froze, his eyes darting wildly as the weight of her words sank in. His gun hand trembled, and for a brief moment it looked like he might lower the weapon. But then his jaw tightened, and a manic light flared in his eyes. You think anyone cares about your damn footage? Steele barked, waving his gun wildly toward the drone. This is Blackthorn. People like you don't win here. You don't matter. Behind him, Haynes took a cautious step forward, his voice sharp. Steele, put the gun down. Now, don't you start with me, Haynes. Steele snarled, spinning around to face his superior. You're just as deep in this as I am. You signed off on all of it, every cover-up, every payoff. Don't act like you're innocent. Haynes' face darkened, his composure slipping for the first time. Watch your mouth, he growled. You're digging yourself a hole you can't climb out of. Steele laughed bitterly, the sound high and brittle. I'm already in the hole, Vic, and you're in here with me. The factories, the payouts from corporate, they're going to hang us both if this gets out. Serena's stomach clenched as she listened. This was it. Steele's paranoia was dragging Haynes into the light, exposing the tangled web of corruption she had suspected all along. But it wasn't enough. She needed Haynes to react, to confirm Steele's accusations in his own words. Greg's voice crackled in her earpiece. He's naming names. Keep the pressure on. Serena activated the drone speaker again, her voice cutting through Steele's rant. So it's true. The factories are paying you off. poisoning the river and lining your pockets. How many people have you silenced to keep their secrets? Haynes spun toward the drone, his face a mask of fury. You don't know what you're talking about, he shouted. You don't understand how this town works. Then explain it to me. Serena's voice shot back, sharp and unrelenting. Explain how you justify letting people die so you can get a bigger paycheck. Haynes hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. But Steele, consumed by his own panic, filled the silence. Shut up, Haynes, Steele yelled. She's baiting you. Don't tell her anything. But the damage was already done. Haynes' silence spoke volumes, and Steele's outburst only confirmed the truth. Serena tapped her smartwatch, ensuring the drones were recording every second. The evidence was piling up, and the cracks in their facade were growing wider by the second. Haynes' composure finally snapped. You think I wanted this? He shouted, his voice raw with anger and frustration. You think I had a choice? The factories own this town, Harper. They own the police, the courts, the car, mayor's office. If I hadn't played along, they'd have replaced me with someone worse. Someone worse than a man who protects murderers? Serena's voice was like a whip, striking Haynes where it hurt most. You let Steele try to kill me, and you think that makes you the good guy. That was him. Haynes roared, pointing a shaking finger at Steele. I didn't order that. That was all on him. Steele's face twisted with rage. Don't you pin this on me, Vic. You knew what I was doing. You told me to deal with her. I told you to scare her off. Haynes shot back, not shove her into the damn river. Their argument reached a fever pitch, their voices echoing across the riverbank as they hurled accusations at each other. Serena's heart pounded as she watched, her fingers trembling over the smartwatch. This was more than she could have hoped, for Steele and Haynes were tearing each other apart, their corruption laid bare for the drones to record. But she wasn't the only one watching. From her position, Serena caught movement near one of the patrol cars. Two officers who had been standing by, uncertain and uneasy, were now whispering to each other. Their eyes darted between Steele, Haynes and the drones, the weight of what they were witnessing clearly dawning on them. One of them reached for his radio, his face grim. They're turning, Serena murmured to Greg through her earpiece. The officers are starting to realize what's happening. Good, Greg replied. We might not need to take this to court if their own people take them down. But Steele wasn't done. His desperation reached its peak as he turned his gun from the drone to Haynes, his hand shaking violently. You're not pinning this on me, he growled, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. I won't go down for this alone. Haynes stepped back, his hands raised defensively. Think about what you're doing, Steele, he said, his voice low and measured. You pull that trigger, and it's over for both of us. It's already over, Steele spat. I'm just making sure you go down with me. Serena couldn't stay hidden any longer. If Steele fired that gun, the entire situation would spiral out of control. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out from the shadows, her voice ringing out loud and clear. Drop the gun, Steele. It's over. Steele spun toward her, his eyes wild. For a moment he looked like he might shoot, but the sight of her alive, defiant and standing tall seemed to break something in him. His arm wavered, the gun lowering slightly as he stared at her in disbelief. You should be dead, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I saw you go under. You shouldn't be here. But I am, Serena said, her voice steady. And everything you've done is going to come out. The lies, the corruption, the attempted murder, it's all on tape. You can't run from this. Steele's hand trembled, the gun slipping from his grasp and falling to the ground with a dull thud. He sank to his knees, his head hanging low as the weight of his actions finally crushed him. Haynes, seeing the writing on the wall, raised his hands in surrender as the other officers moved in, their faces grim. The drones hovered above, their cameras capturing every moment. Serena stood her ground, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. The fight wasn't over, not yet, but for the first time, justice felt within reach. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the horizon in hues of pale orange and grey as the long, dark night came to an end. Serena Harper stood on the riverbank, the air still heavy with the tension of the confrontation that had just unfolded. Around her, the remnants of the scene were being cleaned up. Steele and Haynes were handcuffed and seated in separate patrol cars, their heads bowed in silent defeat. The other officers moved with a quiet, almost reverent efficiency, their faces pale and unreadable. The weight of what they had witnessed hung over them like a storm cloud. Serena took a deep breath, her chest tight with exhaustion and relief. The drones hovered above her, their soft hum a comforting reminder of the technology that had saved her life and secured the evidence she needed. Greg Mason approached from the edge of the tree line, his laptop under one arm and a grim smile on his face. "Well," he said, his voice low and steady, "that was one hell of a night." Serena managed a faint smile in return. "We got them," she said simply, the words heavy with meaning. Greg nodded, his eyes scanning the scene. Steele's finished. Haynes too. With the footage and the intercepted radio transmissions, they're both done. And those factory connections. That's going to blow this whole thing wide open. "That's the plan," Serena replied, though her voice lacked triumph. She knew this was just the beginning. The corruption she had uncovered ran deep, and while Steele and Haynes were significant pieces of the puzzle, they weren't the entire picture. The factories, the local government, the silent benefactors who allowed all of it to happen, taking them down would be a much longer fight. As if reading her thoughts, Greg placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've done more than anyone else could have. This isn't just a win for you. It's a win for everyone who's been suffering because of them." Serena nodded but didn't speak. She didn't feel like celebrating. Not yet. The official fallout began before noon. By the time Serena and Greg returned to their rented workspace in the nearby town, news of Steele and Haynes' arrests had already spread. Local reporters swarmed the police station, their cameras rolling as the two men were led inside in handcuffs. The footage captured by Serena's drones had been quietly sent to a trusted environmental watchdog group, who wasted no time distributing it to national outlets. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Corruption exposed in Blackthorn, police and factories linked to environmental crimes. Serena watched the coverage unfold on a small TV in the corner of the room. Her name wasn't mentioned, she had made sure of that, but the footage was unmistakable. Steele's furious outbursts, Haynes' panicked admissions, the trucks at the factory, it was all there, undeniable and damning. The reporters were already calling it one of the biggest local scandals in years, with promises of broader investigations to come. Greg turned off the TV, his expression thoughtful. "You're not taking credit." "Not yet," Serena said, leaning back in her chair. "It's not about me. It's about the people who live here. They need to see this for what it is: systemic corruption, not just a couple of bad cops. If my name gets attached, it becomes a story about me. That's not the point." Greg nodded, respecting her decision. "So, what's next?" Serena hesitated, the weight of the question settling over her. "We keep going," she said finally. "The factories are the next target. If we can prove they've been bribing officials and dumping illegally, this whole system comes crashing down." "And Steele?" Greg asked. "You think he'll talk?" Serena's lips curled into a faint smile. "He doesn't have a choice." True to her prediction, Steele cracked under pressure. Within days of his arrest, Facing a mountain of evidence and the prospect of decades in prison, Steele agreed to a deal. He gave investigators everything they needed: names, dates, financial records. His testimony painted a grim picture of a town held hostage by corporate greed, with the police department acting as enforcers for the factory's illegal activities. Haynes tried to hold out longer, but when it became clear that Steele's testimony implicated him as well, he folded. Both men would spend the rest of their lives in prison, their reputations in ruins. The fallout spread quickly. High-ranking officials in the local government were indicted, factory executives were arrested, and environmental agencies descended on Blackthorn like a storm. The factories were hit with massive fines, their operations shut down pending further investigation. For the first time in years, the river was silent, its waters no longer churning with the filth of unchecked pollution. But for Serena, the fight wasn't over. A month after the arrests, Serena stood on the same bridge where Steele had tried to kill her. The scars of that night were still fresh, both on her body and in her mind. The bridge itself was unchanged, its rusted frame a stark reminder of the town's neglect. But the river below was different. The drones she had deployed in the weeks since the scandal broke had already begun to record improvements in the water quality. The change was small but significant, a sign that the ecosystem might recover, given time and care. Greg joined her, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket as he looked out over the water. "You did good, you know," he said after a long silence. "Most people would have given up after what you went through. Hell, most people wouldn't have made it out of that river." "I didn't have a choice," Serena replied, her voice quiet but firm. "Someone had to do something." Greg smiled faintly. "And now?" Serena turned to face him, her eyes bright with determination. "Now, I make sure it doesn't happen again. Here or anywhere else." Greg nodded, his respect for her unwavering. "You've got a lot of people behind you now. You've proven that one person can make a difference. But don't forget to take care of yourself too." Serena smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in weeks. "I will, eventually." They stood there for a while longer, watching the river flow beneath them. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was a start. In the days that followed, Serena's name began to circulate quietly in activist circles. The footage she had captured, combined with the evidence her drones had gathered, became a rallying cry for environmental justice movements across the country. She received emails and calls from people she had never met, thanking her for what she had done, asking how they could help, offering to join her fight. For Serena, it was humbling and a reminder of why she had started this journey in the first place. The work was far from over, but she no longer felt alone. The tide was turning, and she was determined to keep pushing until the current swept away the corruption and neglect that had plagued places like Blackthorn for far too long. The river still had a long way to go before it could heal, but so did she. And for the first time in a long time, Serena Harper believed that healing was possible.